Welcome to the Siddha Podcast. Today's guest is Wuttke. Marty has an immense experience in neurotherapy, in neurofeedback, with more than 45 years of experience as a clinician. And he is also a long-term meditator and yogi. And he is the author of the book The Brain Sutras. Welcome, Marty.
Thank you.
And today we are going to talk about spiritual growth. How would you define spiritual growth? And
I think it's important to recognize that we're already spiritual beings, and really what we call spiritual growth is sort of the unveiling of our true spiritual nature that encompasses many different characteristics. So it's not necessarily growth as much as it is an unveiling of our spiritual qualities and attributes. And for that, there are many traditions that lay out a strategic course in order to unveil those spiritual qualities and attributes.
what would the course be in Kriya Yoga?
Kriya Yoga, for instance, follows the direction of various ancient, you can call them yogic scriptures. The one most applicable is the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, where Patanjali, the writer, lays out very clearly the appropriate practices and tools that we have in order to unveil these qualities or attributes of the soul. And there's sort of a moral compass, and again, many traditions have that sort of thing, pointing out that spiritual evolution involves the manifestation of certain qualities that are very important as a foundation for our spiritual awareness.
When you talk about qualities, are you talking about cities?
No. They're, the virtues are essentially the qualities and attributes that emerge as we engage in our self-disciplines. So things like humility, empathy, compassion, harmlessness, trust, contentment. In essence, we become, we're working on becoming better people, better human beings, so that those qualities can be cultivated and flow from us to our immediate environment and to the people that we engage with and so on.
So what you're saying is that with spiritual practices, we basically foster those qualities, and we will show these qualities more and more. So would that be also like a sign of how spiritual advanced someone is if someone shows these qualities? Or how can I actually see or say or judge if someone is spiritually advanced?
Well, I think that some of the qualities I mentioned, particularly humility, contentment, freedom from anxiety and from worry, are clearly associated with a higher degree of spiritual awareness. And as I said, they're important to cultivate. You can't just kind of depend on, if you do your meditation and your various spiritual practices, that those things are going to naturally emerge. Sometimes we have to work on them. We have to sort of do an inventory and see where we might be lacking. And so if it's if empathy is a problem, then we have to learn about empathy and practice compassion and not judging our fellow beings on the path, but rather supporting them. I think that's probably the number one word is support. Can we support those people that come to us or that are involved in their own spiritual disciplines? Can we support them in their journey? And I think that's very important.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about these qualities, humility, and all that, basically becoming a better human being, you could say too. How does spiritual growth defined in that way how is that different from personal growth, for example?
I think personal growth and what we call spiritual growth run hand in hand. In other words, if we're on a spiritual path, there is going to be personal growth in order for us to, get in touch with our own inner being, which you can say is spiritual. I mean, we're not these bodies. We are a spirit manifesting through these bodies. But I think that, at least in the beginning, personal growth is an important ingredient to spiritual growth and a prerequisite, by the way.
So, speaking in modern terms, could someone do psychotherapy to foster spiritual growth?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Maslow's, pyramid of self-actualization is a psychological method for spiritual growth. So, and that, depending on the psychotherapist, of course, and the theory they use, there is a great value in cultivating the virtues. It makes us better people. It makes us more responsible for ourselves and for the environment and for the people in our lives. I think they run hand in hand, but there's a certain point where, just doing psychotherapy or working on ourselves from that psychological perspective, there's a certain point where something has to be added to that, and that's where this notion of self-realization and God-realization comes in.
What is God and self-realization?
Self-realization is the realization that we are spiritual beings at the core, at the essence, that we're not these bodies, that these bodies are just vehicles, important vehicles, though. We have to keep in mind they're not to be abused, they're to be taken care of. This notion of the body as a temple is not just a nice thing to say, it is an absolute reality. God realization, though, is a step beyond that and can be difficult for the average person to comprehend, because God realization is the realization that God dwells within us as us, and then that intellectual understanding turns into an actual experience, the experience of the awareness of this omniscient, omnipresent reality that some spiritual teachings refer to as God, but is an ever-present experience that is open to us. But there's a lot that has to be sort of cleared up along the way until we come to that realization.
We have mentioned cities shortly, and Patanjali Yoga in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, cities are mentioned. And Roy Eugene Davis, he defines cities as exceptional powers of perception and abilities which may emerge with spiritual growth. Although they may be selflessly used for constructive mundane purposes, they should be primarily used to nurture complete spiritual awakening. So, how would you define cities, and can you maybe name one or two?
Well, cities, translated as soul abilities. So as our spiritual senses begin to be unveiled, we may suddenly spontaneously discover, that we have some exceptional powers of perception. And a lot of people focus on these psychic abilities, so-called psychic abilities, but they're natural to each one of us. They evolve spontaneously, and as Roy Eugene Davis mentioned, they're only to be used in a selfless manner, not in a manner to manipulate other people or to manipulate our environment, but rather to contribute to our own spiritual awareness and the awareness of other people. There are many, many cities, some more, extravagant than others. There are many saints who demonstrate cities, and people talk about them as miracles, but they're not these other worldly powers. They happen to be resident to each one of us. So as I said, there's many, many cities. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali describes many of them. But that's not the goal, and that's the important part about cities. It's not the goal of our spiritual practices. The goal of our spiritual practices is to get a sense of our own inner being and the inner being of everyone we meet, and of the whole existence of this planet and the universe in every moment. It is literally an expression of divine consciousness. And so that's the goal, to find that state, and then to learn how to live in that state of consciousness.
Sometimes when people, start meditating and hear about the cities, they may meet a person who they think they have a certain city. If a person has a city, does that mean that this person is also highly spiritual advanced?
That's a good question. Not necessarily, no. Many people can spontaneously, experience, different manifestations of a city, from clairvoyance to clairaudience, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are spiritually advanced. I know a fellow once, as I was in my early stages of meditation and spiritual disciplines, a fellow who had blindfolded himself for a year, and that basically enabled his hearing and kinesthetic touch to become so acute. He could take a watch, for instance, and hold the watch and immediately come up with all kinds of images in his mind about the person, and not just about the person's present reality, but about their past and potential future. It was quite remarkable, but this fellow I'm referring to would admit, doesn't mean everybody has that ability. He just took, rather severe steps to develop that city, quite literally.
So it's basically abilities we can train separately.
Yes.
If if that would be the plan.
Yeah.
But then we can't get sidetracked by that. It's like being in the garden, right? But not going into the actually house.
Yeah, exactly. And what he would do, of course, is he would have group meetings, and people would come just absolutely fascinated by somebody being able to psychically read them. And that's what people came for, not so much for how can I cultivate my own inner awareness and sense of spirituality. It became more of a, almost a novelty, a sideshow, if you will. And I remember when he realized that, he stopped doing it. Roy Eugene Davis had a similar experience. He very early on developed the ability to sit with somebody, meditate for a moment, and same thing would happen. He'd get all kinds of images about them. Maybe he'd see their dog and be able to sort of describe where they lived and so on. But he also, the point of that was he was doing counseling with them, saying this would be a good practice for you. But most people, unfortunately, are more drawn to the novelty of it and am I going to find the right relationship or job or that sort of thing, and that's not the point of these abilities.
Right. Let's come back to the spiritual growth and what we can actually do. So what can people really do to foster their spiritual growth, and what are the most important things to do?
I think a certain degree of self-responsibility and self-reflection is important. In some traditions they say do a searching and fearless moral inventory. Find those points in your personality or your character that need to be tweaked a little bit, because it's those obstacles that keep us from really seeing and experiencing who we are at the depths. So, first of all, pinpointing those areas that we need to work on. And there's many guides for that. As I mentioned earlier, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras define very clearly, succinctly too, what these certain virtues are: humility, contentment, harmlessness, and so on. And so really making an effort to pay attention to these, at least in the beginning, in other words, to cultivate the virtues. Benjamin Franklin, he wrote a book where he would take a number of virtues, and he would spend an entire day on a single virtue and make sure that he was, being congruent with that virtue in his behavior in life. And that can be very useful. So I think it's about picking, a virtue or someplace where we're maybe falling a little short of manifesting that in our personality, and then working on it.
Right. And so in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, there are also different steps, the namas and niyamas people can read about, which are basically guidelines which support wholesome and healthy life, which automatically support us in letting go of our weaknesses in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, meditation is an important method to also become more aware, because I think being more aware, first of all, you have to become the observer, be more aware to actually see your weaknesses, and then when you see these weaknesses, then you can, work on them. But often it also helps to have a coach, a psychotherapist, or ideally a spiritual teacher who can also pinpoint you to your weaknesses,
Yeah.
so you can work on them.
Yeah, it's good to have a mentor, somebody who can serve as an example of what it is, we're trying to achieve.
Right.
And those mentors are usually, spiritually awake and no longer have to practice or cultivate the virtues. They actually become the virtues. It is their natural expression versus, oh, I need to be more empathetic, I need to be less judgmental. They naturally start to manifest those qualities, and the work on them becomes less necessary because they are already manifesting those qualities. Some of it also, obviously, has to do with, our past, our upbringing, how well we were exposed to these spiritual qualities as we're growing up, and the people we were exposed to, the environment. The more natural it is, the more spiritually based it is, the more we're going to be able to overcome any obstacles along the way.
Can you say maybe just a little bit more about the obstacles, or what is an obstacle, for example?
Well, ego is the biggest obstacle, and a sense of self-importance. Although we're all important, but at a certain level, we're all the same. I've written in my book, everybody is special in terms of they are a spiritual being manifesting, but nobody's special. It's sort of a paradoxical statement. Sounds like it's in conflict, but it's really not. We're all on a spiritual path, whether we know it or not, and I mean everyone. And life is gently, and sometimes not so gently, trying to teach us how to modify our thoughts, our behaviors, and so on. So if that is our goal, so that our spiritual essence can begin to become more and more evident.
Mm-hmm. Maybe last question. Sometimes, people step on the spiritual path and start meditating, and they have, experiences. But then, as years go by, those, fantastic and motivating experiences may not always be there. What would you say to someone, who says, oh, I feel like, it's not moving so much? Yeah.
Well, first, be patient. There tends to be rises and falls as we, evolve on the spiritual path. Sometimes we might think we've really accomplished a lot, but then all of a sudden, life hits us with, not necessarily a trauma, but a wake-up call. Like this, there's something there that still needs to be adjusted, whether it's thought in our thoughts, our behavior, or our feelings. Emotional maturity is one of the number one components, and very necessary components of moving forward on the spiritual path. And tolerance and humility and learning how not to judge other people. So sometimes we might find, that as we are moving along on our spiritual path, that some of these things start to pop up. But the suggestion that we're giving is meditate. And the more we meditate, the more we're sort of opening our own essence of being, our soul, if you will, and that ultimately will neutralize most of these I don't want to call them negative qualities, but at least qualities that we know are hindrances on the path.
Yeah. All right, great. So thank you very much.
Thank
With
you.
that, I hope everyone stays on their path and stick with the spiritual practices. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the best to all of you.
Thank you.
Bye.